Hello guys, welcome back to our anime explainer. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Soul Land 2 Peerless Tangmen based on novel. So let's start. It's time to move. The troops stationed in the east and west have already moved towards the north. Kai too should have succeeded. Jing Ziyan fiddled with a little device in her hand. Shu Sanxia nodded. Ji Juechen stood beside Jing Ziyan. He now had his usual stern face on, as he tightly gripped the judgment sword in his right hand. Jing Ziyan turned to Shu Sanxia and said, "The troops outside the South City haven't made a move yet. It seems like they've received an order to remain there no matter what. Are we going to start the plan or not?" Shu Sanxia shook his head. "Let's just wait for a bit longer. Once Yuhao makes his move, the Soul Engineer Legion outside the city will definitely not be able to stay silent anymore. They should send a few soldiers away to the front. That's when we'll make our move." "Okay." Jing Ziyan nodded. Shu Sanxia closed his eyes, as though he had entered a meditative state, standing up. Streams of dull, black air started to move about near him, and the other three moved away from him. Standing near him made them feel as if they'd sunken into quicksand. Huo Yuhao didn't make them wait for long. After a few minutes, the large explosion coming from the southern moat occurred. The terrifying explosive power it released made the city walls tremble, and even caused cracks to appear in many places. Sure enough, the army stationed outside the city made a move the instant something came up. Via her soul detector, Jing Ziyan was able to tell that the troops stationed there were a mess. It seemed like they were gathering together. "Prepare to move out. Go to your designated positions." Shu Sanxia let out a low shout. Yi Gai, Ji Juechen, and Jing Ziyan quickly ran towards a circle drawn not far away from Shu Sanxia. 2 yellow, 2 purple, and 2 black soul rings rose from Shu Sanxia's feet. An enormous black tortoise image also appeared behind him. A pitch-black Xuanwu shield appeared noiselessly in his palm. As Shu Sanxia turned towards the sky, Jing Ziyan took out another soul tool and pressed a button on it. When all of the aerial surveillance soul tools above Sunrise City were destroyed by the Zhuge divine crossbow cannons, Jing Ziyan quietly fired 2 soul tools into the sky. One was an aerial surveillance soul tool similar to that used by the Sun Moon Empire, specifically used to monitor the situation of the Soul Engineer Legion outside the city. The sudden appearance of an enemy, moreover in 3 different areas, was especially devastating. The southern city's most important duty was to protect the water prison, but they were instantly turned into blind men following the destruction of all of their aerial surveillance soul tools. Although they were prepared to launch replacements, they still needed a bit more time. Naturally, they couldn't be faster than someone like Jing Ziyan, who was already prepared. Other than the aerial surveillance soul tool, the other thing Jing Ziyan had fired was much stranger. Even she didn't know what it was. That thing was very large, around 5 meters long and shaped like a huge umbrella. This was the largest soul tool they'd brought along with them. The instant Shu Sanxia announced the start of the mission, Jing Ziyan pressed the button that activated this umbrella-shaped soul tool. Immediately, a point in the sky lit up, and the huge umbrella opened up. The enormous umbrella had a diameter of nearly 10 meters, and released a bright silver light. A weak beam of light, and had no offensive capabilities, instantly landed outside the city by the barracks, about 10 kilometers away from Shu Sanxia. The appearance of this beam of light was precisely when the barracks was in a state of chaos, the instant they'd sent out reinforcements to Sunrise City. Due to the lack of aerial surveillance soul tools, only a few people noticed the glow of this beam of light that accompanied the opening of the huge umbrella, and felt that something wasn't right. At this exact moment, a brilliant light shot out from Shu Sanxia's eyes. With his Xuanwu shield held high, his 4th soul ring lit up. The umbrella-shaped soul tool shot out another beam of light. This time around, it shone on the circle Yi Gai and the others were standing in. Shu Sanxia leapt forward, jumping into this ray of light. Right after that, the dark light on his Xuanwu shield lit up brightly. With a flash, he vanished into thin air. However, a flabbergasted soul engineer from the Sun Moon Empire's Soul Engineer Legion appeared in his place and directly fell to the ground. Ji Juechen made an overly simple movement with his judgment sword, causing the struggling soul engineer to vanish. Right after that, another light flashed. Ji Juechen vanished into thin air, but Shu Sanxia returned. The enormous umbrella-shaped soul tool in the sky was something Xian Ziwen had created especially for Shu Sanxia, called a soul mirror. This was a soul tool that could utilize the mirror within the huge umbrella to magnify an image of places far away for Shusansha to look at. If Shusansha still had his mysterious underworld shield, this soul tool would have been of no use to him at all. However, certain impossible things had become possible following his martial soul's evolution into the Xuanwu shield. For example, he could now use his mysterious underworld displacement on anything within his line of sight. It would now be more appropriate to call it the Xuanwu displacement. Shusansha had used this soul tool to transport himself over to the Soul Engineer Legion, then sent Jijuechen over afterwards. At this moment, there were still not many people within the Southern Soul Engineer Legion who had discovered what had just occurred. Jijuechen appeared out of thin air, then gently landed. Immediately afterwards, he charged out from the circle of light that the soul mirror had created. The surrounding soul engineers felt something was off. Immediately, someone came up to question him. Jijuechen possessed a certain level of strength. He shot forward like a bolt of lightning and grabbed at a soul engineer who was questioning him. He threw him into the circle of light with a flip of his hand. And so, Shusansha returned. After 3 consecutive displacements, Shusansha, Jingxian, and Yigai used the same method to forcefully charge into the Southern Soul Engineer Legion several dozen kilometers away from them. Even a titled Doluo, who was skilled in spatial abilities, wouldn't be able to use an instant teleportation that could cross a distance that far. However, Shusansha had done it, albeit with the aid of a soul tool. Naturally, he was drained of a large amount of soul power following this displacement. He held a milk bottle in each of his hands and began recovering his soul power immediately after he reappeared. Only at this moment did the men in the barracks realize that something was wrong. However, the soul mirror in the sky had already been put away by Jingxian. This little thing was still useful to them. There was even a possibility that they would need this to save Huo Yuhao and the rest later. A large number of soul engineers started to surround them, blocking them off. The first person to make a move, however, was still the sword fanatic. Even if he had love in his heart, his fighting style would never change. With his judgment sword pointed towards the sky, he took a step forward with his left foot. Then, he made a half-turn and swept his longsword horizontally. An intense, chilly light spread out in a fan-shaped sweep. The soul engineers who were activating their soul tools in order to attack felt a chill pervade their bodies, then lost consciousness in the next moment. Yi Gai was standing behind Jijuechen, and thus was able to see him most clearly. Jijuechen's horizontal sweep contained a biting cold sword light that reached out a full 100 meters, and no living beings remained wherever his sword passed. At least 30 Class 3 and 4 soul engineers were cut down with a single stroke of his sword. This fellow is really scary. Yi Gai felt a chill go up her spine. She clearly remembered how she and Nan Qiuqiu had constantly challenged him to fight. She could now tell from the imposing aura coming off Jijuechen's sword that he had been going easy on them all this while. Jijuechen didn't stop moving. With his sword in his hand, he shot through areas with the most number of people like a bolt of lightning. The judgment sword in his hand seemed to look disdainfully upon its enemies, and corpses littered the ground wherever it swept past. It would be very hard to determine who was the strongest person in the Tang sect. However, if one were to talk about the most destructive, and the person whose ability to kill was greatest, the answers to these questions would be Hikaitu and Jijuechen. If one were to take out the use of soul tools, then only Jijuechen would remain. Many soul engineers already had their soul tools pointed at Jijuechen. However, the troops stationed here were not the best troops that the Sun Moon Empire had. Their greatest strength lay in defending the military front, as well as the soul tool formations they'd set up in advance. Just as a soul engineer's worst nightmare was fighting against a soul master in close combat, the way this army fought was also susceptible to close combat. The area inside the front itself was the weakest point of the Soul Engineer Legion. Jijuechen was already a soul sage, but his destructive power wasn't something that ordinary soul sages could compare to. Those Class 3 and 4 soul tools were completely destroyed by his chilly sword intent before they even reached him. The only person who made him pause slightly was a Class 6 soul engineer. However, the sad thing was that this soul engineer was skilled at close combat. Thus, Jijuechen gripped his sword with both hands. After standing still for a brief moment, the area between him and the Class 6 soul engineer turned into a patch of grey. This was the sword fanatic's domain, the solitary domain. Afterwards, there was no afterwards. The sword fanatic would never show mercy to an opponent. This was especially true after he'd gotten a new lover. His lover was standing on this battlefield, and one less opponent meant one greater chance that his lover would remain safe. This had also caused the fighting intent in this cold man to reach an unprecedented level. Naturally, in Ji Juechen's own opinion, he stubbornly believed that the reason his will to fight had grown stronger was because he had found the right path. Yes, this was the power of love. While Ji Juechen was killing his way through the battlefield, the others didn't just laze around. As if she had sprinkled beans on the ground to create soldiers, Jing Ziyan released an all-terrain self-driving soul fort and hid herself within it. As a member of the Tang sect, although she didn't know how to create soul tools, she was relatively proficient at using them. One couldn't forget that she had originally come from the Sun Moon Soul Engineering Academy. After seriously practicing their use a few times, she was naturally skilled at using this all-terrain self-driving soul fort. The all-terrain self-driving fort she drove had been enhanced. The moment it entered its control mode, over 100 cannons started to fire furiously. It was as if it did not require any soul power at all as it shot the soul cannons placed by the Soul Engineer legions to smithereens. It actually did not require any soul power. Specifically, it did not require any of Jing Ziyan's soul power. This all-terrain self-driving fort was equipped with more than 30 Class 5 milk bottles. It could fight for hours without recharging, and Jing Ziyan now used it to its maximum potential. Instantly, the Soul Engineers whose positions were under fire were sent running in all directions. All of the Soul Engineer legions of the Sun Moon Empire had a subordinate army. After all, Soul Engineers were more important and costlier. Someone had to do the dirty and tiring work, such as raising the outer defenses. That was work for the subordinate army. To the south of the city, there were more Soul Engineers in position, numbering around 300. There was a Class 8 Soul Engineer, 2 Class 7 Soul Engineers, and 5 Class 6 Soul Engineers. Coupled with the many other Soul Engineers who had taken up position there, their defenses were very tight. However, at this moment, the Class 8 Soul Engineer had brought the 2 Class 7 Soul Engineers to reinforce the south of the city. There were no strong Soul Engineers left over there. The subordinate army, realizing that something was wrong, charged over. However, the many less powerful Soul Engineers fell into despair under the heavy bombardment from the all-terrain self-driving fort and the sharp sword chi of the sword fanatic. The inky black light only started to dissipate at this very moment. Shu Sanxia did not even need to maximize the power of his Xuanwu domain. All he had to do was to ensure that its area of effect was maximized. Everything within a 250-meter radius appeared to have turned into a swamp. Everyone, both Soul Engineers and the subordinate army, who rushed into this area immediately felt as if they had dived into a deep pool of mud. There was no way they could even see the location of the sword fanatic and the all-terrain self-driving fort. This was the strength of the Tang sect and Shrek Academy. While Soul Engineers continually threatened the position of Soul Masters, truly powerful Soul Masters were highly intimidating. Even Xu Qianran, who had a high opinion of himself, had no choice but to collaborate with the Holy Ghost Church because of his fear of powerful Soul Masters. Shrek Academy was one such power he feared greatly. Shu Sanxia and the other three could not sustain this onslaught for long. Once the Soul Engineer legions reacted properly, they would gather even more soul tools to take care of them. They would be in trouble then. However, by launching this sudden attack, what they wanted to do now was not to destroy the positions of the Soul Engineers, but to create as much chaos as possible. This would create enough opportunities for Huo Yuhao and the others to break out with the hostages. Inside the water prison, the many hostages rushed out like a group of starving tigers had just been released. They had suffered greatly over the past few months, and they hated the evil Soul Masters with all their guts. The moment they could, they covered the entire area with long-range attacks launched at full power, killing more than half of the weaker evil Soul Masters. The Zhong brothers realized that the situation was turning bad for them, and they made their way to the exit while defending themselves. Their attackers were a few hundred Soul Masters. Even the weakest ones had at least 4 rings. Even if there were no powerful titled Doluor, there were still many powerful Soul Sages and Soul Doluor, most of whom were teachers, or powerful members of the various sects. Their numbers rivaled that of a Soul Engineer Legion. In terms of individual fighting abilities, they surpassed the Soul Engineer Legions. How could the brothers possibly beat them? Huo Yuhao did not try to stop the Zhong brothers from leaving. The 3 of them were extremely powerful, and they specialized in controlling the souls of soul beasts to fight. They were all 8-ringed evil soul masters, and the moment they got over their shock, they would wreak horrific destruction. Ma Xiaodao could not delay the two evil-titled Doluo for long, either. After such a huge commotion, they would surely return shortly. Hence, the most important thing for them to do was rush out. They had to break through the seal of the soul engineers outside and reach somewhere spacious. Even a titled Doluo would not dare to fight against more than 100 soul masters at once. Hence, the most important thing right now was to break out as far as they could. Huo Yuhao knew what to do afterward. He activated his spiritual detection, sharing fully, and in the minds of every emotionally charged person, the same voice resonated: calm yourselves. Follow me and break out. As he said that, Huo Yuhao turned around and looked toward the south of the city, which had been completely flattened. His body started to shine with an eye-catching jade-green light. In the next instant, a thick jade-green pillar of light pierced through the sky and bombarded the area over there. An intense explosion sounded, and flakes of ice flew in all directions. A huge hole had appeared in the wall. Huo Yuhao's soul thruster shone with light once more as he quickly arrived in front of the hole. As the hostages watched, dark golden claws almost 10 meters long appeared suddenly and silently. The broken hole became 5 times larger. Someone, either a powerful member of a random sect or a teacher, gasped and said, "The dark golden terraclaw. Go now." Huo Yuhao cried out. This time, his voice was filled with spiritual undulations. While many of these hostages' soul power had recovered, and they had also been soaked in a reinvigorating medicine, they had also been imprisoned in the water prison for a few months. Their strength was far from optimal. Hence, they could not wait until their bodies showed signs of fatigue. There could be no delay in their breakout. As for the Zhong brothers, Huo Yuhao believed that they would not dare re-enter for the moment. There were a few hundred soul masters here. No matter who was guarding them, surely their first response right now was to get help. Huo Yuhao, who was at the front, rushed out first. The moat outside was now riddled with explosions. Right now, the water from the moat was flowing outwards. Huo Yuhao's soul thruster fired down to ensure that he could remain suspended in mid-air. As his hands touched the water, one could clearly see that they were enveloped in diamond-like ice crystals. This was his Ice Empress pincer. A cold gas started to spread, and turned into 2 rays of emerald green light. First, they struck the surging water, which slowed, and then stopped. Then, under the terrifying chill of his ultimate ice, Huo Yuhao froze the moat solid. As he pulled his hands apart, he cast his gaze afar. The soul engineers had been thrown into complete disarray. At this moment, a team of around 50 soul engineers was rushing toward them. When they saw Huo Yuhao, a ball of blinding red light flew toward him like a shooting star in the night sky. A smile crept across Huo Yuhao's face. He had expected this. The 50 soul engineers stationed outside the southern gate were caught between a rock and a hard place. They had realized that something was amiss at their flank, but they had no choice but to push forward. As he watched the high explosive bomb hurtling toward him, Huo Yuhao did not try to dodge. A layer of golden light shone from his body, and his eyes turned completely golden. In his eyes, he was analyzing the path of this high explosive bomb. With his terrifying spiritual power, his ability to analyze any single object was intimidating. He raised his right hand, and diamond-like ice crystals shone brightly on his hand. Then, he reached out to grab the incoming high explosive bomb. Poof! A curious scene appeared. The moment Huo Yuhao's right hand grabbed the high explosive bomb, the explosion the soul engineers were expecting did not materialize. Instead, the red light surrounding the high explosive bomb faded. Its impact, however, made Huo Yuhao waver slightly in mid-air. Following that, the high explosive bomb was completely destroyed in Huo Yuhao's hand. A high explosive bomb's power came from an intense compression of fire-type soul power. With the formation array of a Class 6 soul tool, its soul power was further destabilized before it was fired. Once it hit its target or met any resistance, it would disrupt and cause a massive explosion. What Huo Yuhao did was use his spiritual power to find the location of its unstable core and then, with his ultimate ice, freeze it. While it sounded simple, it was extremely difficult to locate the highly unstable core of a powerful high explosive bomb in such a short time. However, he did it almost perfectly. "It's my turn," Huo Yuhao muttered to himself. Then, the air around him started to twist and turn as he activated his spiritual interference. In the eyes of the 50 soul engineers facing him, the person who was floating in mid-air disappeared. The originally destroyed city walls regained their original state, as did the moat. It was as if nothing had happened, and everything had been a dream. This, for the 50 soul engineers, who were all armed to the teeth and wielding their favorite soul tools, this scene left them speechless. They had no qualms about attacking their enemies, but right now, the city walls and the moat in front of them were completely intact. Where were their targets? How could they fire with no target? No, this is an illusion. I order Dash, the Soul Engineer Legion commander, was a Class 8 Soul Engineer. He had seen many things in his life, and after a momentary pause, he realized that something was amiss. However, he did not manage to issue his order. An odd golden whirlpool suddenly appeared above his head. He felt everything in front of him go blurry, and forcibly swallowed his words. His thoughts were scattered. This was Huo Yuhao's fourth soul skill, spiritual confusion. While Huo Yuhao was at rank 60, he only had 5 soul rings. However, with the terrifying strength of his spiritual power, while he lacked the fighting abilities of a 6-ring soul master, he had no need to conserve soul power like other soul masters, as he used the many soul skills of his spirit eyes. He used his spiritual power to replace the functions of his soul power. From when he had first entered the water prison until now, he had used his soul skills one after the other without stopping, yet remained in his prime state. 1 versus 50. Huo Yuhao was not that dumb or that powerful. His opponents included Class 7 and Class 8 soul engineers. Right now, his role was not one of an assault-type soul master, but instead one of a control-type soul master. His objective was to control the entire battlefield. After a momentary pause, dozens of figures rushed out of the illusion from the river, which still appeared intact. The greatest advantage of Huo Yuhao's spiritual detection was fully exemplified at this very moment. After he broke out from the water prison, he used his spiritual detection to accurately determine the distance of the 50 soul engineers from the southern part of the city. They were less than 100 meters away from the river. This distance, to soul engineers, was not safe at all. After the dozens of soul masters rushed over from the frozen riverbed of the river, they would be less than 100 meters away from the confused soul engineers. Under Huo Yuhao's spiritual detection, the hostages were split into 3 forces. Among them, those with 6 rings and above were split into 2 groups. One group would rush forward first as the vanguard. The other group would remain at the back to keep the rear safe. The other soul masters, who had fewer than 6 soul rings, would remain in the center. This meant that the first wave of those who rushed out all had at least 6 rings. They were all at least soul emperors. The moment they rushed out of the river, they maximized their speed as they rushed toward the soul engineers like frenzied tigers. The soul engineers finally reacted. Rays of light shot out from their soul tools. If the 2 sides were in formation, and if there was enough distance between them, the hostages would not have an advantage no matter how powerful they were. This was because the soul engineer legions of the Sun Moon Empire had trained together for a very long time. Various soul tools could work in tandem with one another, helping each other out, and hence, they would be able to project much more power than what their numbers might suggest. However, the 50 soul engineers were currently faced with an impossible scenario. They had lost their center of command, and they could not put enough distance between themselves and their enemies. When they finally reacted, they were naturally unable to unleash their most powerful attacks. The soul masters they faced right now were the best from some of the most powerful sects and schools in the world. They were the elites among the elites. Furthermore, these elites had a commander. Their commander's spiritual detection covered the entire battlefield, and was able to accurately convey distance, speed, angle, strength, and other types of information on every soul ray and soul cannon shell to them. Their commander was none other than the control-type Soul King, the Eyes of Azura, Huo Yuhao. Huo Yuhao was able to gain the respect of the number 1 academy in the world, Shrek Academy, enter the Sea Gods Pavilion before the age of 20, and become one of its members. This was due to his strength and unlimited potential. With each life and death experience, adventure, and obstacle, he was able to grow at a speed that even Elder Mu did not anticipate. After he recovered his ability to move again, and completed his closed-door training, Huo Yuhao was like a caterpillar that had finally become a butterfly. He had reached a completely new level. Among Shrek's 7 monsters, he was ranked first in terms of strength. His overall strength surpassed that of a soul sage. Spiritual detection, spiritual sharing. In the eyes of the soul engineers and soul masters who were fighting, these were godly skills. 4 8-ringed soul doluor, 12 7-ringed soul sages, and around 20 soul emperors charged out in advance of the hostages. They were the elites of the elites. Under the instructions of Huo Yuhao's spiritual detection, coupled with the furious fighting spirit that rose non-stop in their hearts, how could they show any mercy to their foes? When the commander of the Soul Engineer Legion, the Class 8 Soul Engineer, finally snapped out of the confusion Huo Yuhao had induced in him with his spiritual confusion, he saw dozens of furious Soul Masters who were only a hair's breadth away. The Soul Masters were able to rush up to the Soul Engineers without incurring any casualties. One could imagine what happened next. Huo Yuhao did not participate personally in the fight. He flew above the heads of the Soul Engineers and unleashed his spiritual interference to its fullest extent, enveloping the battlefield completely. Near the core where most of the fighting took place, nothing other than sound could spread to the outside world. Since Huo Yuhao's spiritual interference reached its domain stage, this was the first time he had used it over such a huge area. As the 50 Soul Engineers were destroyed, all of the hostages rushed out of the water prison. At this moment, in the sky above Sunrise City, one could see colorful fireworks exploding. This was probably a distress signal the three Zhong brothers had released. Huo Yuhao did not even look at it. Right now, he was in a race against time. The three Zhong brothers were not scary. Even the two evil titled Doluo were not scary. What was scary was the huge amount of troops that could come from Radiant City. Once they arrived, they would be in serious trouble. After all, the 5 most powerful Soul Engineer legions of the Sun Moon Empire were all equipped with flying-type soul tools. If they used their flying-type soul tools, they would be able to reach Sunrise City from Radiant City pretty quickly. Charge! Without giving the hostages any time to rest, Huo Yuhao immediately gave the order to charge. Shusansha and the rest still held on, but how much longer could they hold on? They could only escape if they broke through the positions the Soul Engineers had taken up to the south of the city. The taste of freedom was a huge motivation for these hostages. Every single one of them was in an almost frenzied state as they charged south. At this moment, a thunderous explosion sounded. This made Huo Yuhao, who was in mid-air, turn his head. His face turned dark. How can this be possible? How can it be so fast? Where did the thunderous explosion come from? It came from the northern city walls of Sunrise City, which was the only part that had not yet been hit. However, Huo Yuhao had instructed Jing Ziyan to plant a large number of soul bombs there. The one who could detonate these bombs was He Kai-tu. Before He Kai-tu left, he had planted an aerial surveillance tool there to monitor the situation. This was because any soldiers from Radiant City, who were rushing over to assist their compatriots, had to reach the northern walls first. By placing the bombs, they hoped to injure and kill many of them before they could arrive, as well as attract their attention. The timing of the explosion was completely controlled by He Kai-tu. But the bombs actually went off so quickly. What did this mean? This meant that the soldiers from Radiant City were here already. Only a few minutes had passed since the start of the mission. According to Huo Yuhao's calculations, the soldiers from Radiant City, upon realizing that something was amiss, would need at least an hour to organize themselves, set off, and arrive. This would be more than enough time for him and the hostages to evacuate. However, the arrival of the soldiers from Radiant City was much faster than he had expected. This completely turned the situation around. He quickly informed the hostages to charge toward the positions of the Soul Engineers with all their might. After they defeated their opponents, they had to regroup with the 4 of them, who would then give them instructions to escape safely. After he conveyed this message, Huo Yuhao turned around and flew back toward Sunrise City. Not only did he have to pick up He Kai-tu, but he also had to find Nan Xiuqiu. If he could not save Nan Xiuqiu soon, it would be immensely difficult later, as Sunrise City would have turned into a tiger's den. Of course, for most people, Sunrise City had already turned into a tiger's den. Huo Yuhao was no longer able to control whether the hostages could escape. However, according to his calculations, the series of explosions at the northern city walls would create a huge problem for the soldiers, who were rushing to render assistance. Even if they flew, they would surely descend to ascertain the situation upon seeing the explosion. After all, they could not possibly know what was happening in Sunrise City. The Soul Engineer Legion stationed to the south of Sunrise City had only 250 men, after 50 of them left the main group. After being harassed by Shusansha and the others, they were unable to hold their ground in face of the attacks by powerful Soul Masters. Hence, the hostages still had a good chance of escaping. Huo Yuhao's important task right now was to get everyone from the Tang sect out and save Nan Xiuqiu. Despite having been trained under the ultimate soldier plan, Huo Yuhao knew that emotions played a huge part in his decision-making. The ideal plan now would be to abandon He Kai-tu and Nan Qiuqiu and help the hostages escape. He should not be turning back. However, could he really do that? Of course not. He was not a machine whose only purpose was to complete missions or kill people, but a human with flesh and blood. How could he abandon He Kai-tu and escape all by himself? As for Nan Qiuqiu, while his ties with her were not as deep as his with He Kai-tu, she was still out to save her mother. For Huo Yuhao, nothing touched him more than maternal love. This was why he had told Nan Qiuqiu that if Nan Shuishui was not in the water prison, he would stay behind to help her save her mother. He knew the pain of losing one's mother very clearly. This time, Huo Yuhao did not fly back to Sunrise City via the city walls. Instead, he released his butterfly wings and ascended vertically. Covered by his imitation, he flew straight into the sky. The advantage of doing this was so that he could observe the soldiers, who were coming to assist those in Sunrise City. At the same time, he could bypass the Zhong brothers. This video will end here.